Okay, folks, I hope that your weekend was a great one, and that you guys are doing well. I'm going to cover the loanable funds market next. If you've noticed, I put the assignments on Google Classroom, and the first assignment is one on Khan Academy so that you can go over the gist of what the loanable funds market is. Then I would like for you guys to watch these videos. I'm going to break them down into sections of the loanable funds market so that you don't become so overwhelmed. You go through it piece by piece, and that way then you can have a better understanding of it. So I have put this. This is portion of the notes page that I put on Google Classroom, as well as the questions that we're going to cover in reference to. Sorry, let me zoom out. Okay, these will cover also in just going over the information so that we can practice to allow you to answer the questions or the FRQs that I put on Google Classroom. So the loanable funds market, before we start anything about the loanable funds market, I just want to remind you, the loanable funds market sounds a lot like its title, right? It's loanable funds. It's the supply and the demand of loanable funds. Loanable funds being the funds that we lend out. And who lends out loanable funds if it's not financial institutions to borrowers, right? Where do they get that money? Where do we get the supply of our loanable funds? We'll talk a little bit about later. And then also who demands loanable funds, we'll talk a little bit about later. So there's a few things that I want to cover before we move on to that, is just to remind you of a few things that we had already covered before we left for spring break. So we talked about the present and future value of money at some point. And we basically said, or we agreed, that money is worth more right now than it is in the future because of inflation. So as prices, inflation is the overall increase of prices. And so as prices of goods and services starts to increase as we go through time, then the value of your money initially starts to decrease in its value. And so we need to understand that money right now is worth more than money in the future. And because of the idea of inflation, then whenever anyone is lending somebody money, again, hence the loanable funds market, whenever anyone is lending somebody money, the price of lending or borrowing that money is going to be called the interest rate. So I want to talk a little bit about interest rates before we get started, because it's really important that you understand interest rates and why we charge interest on loans, or why we earn interest on savings. So there's two ways that interest can affect you. So when people lend out money, right, because they know that inflation is going to occur, they're going to want to charge that borrower a certain amount of interest, right? So people will lend out money, they're going to charge the interest rate. The real interest rate is signified by a little r with a percentage sign. We talked about the real interest rate, and this being the formula for the real interest rate. So the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. Remember, nominal is designated by a little I and the percentage sign, minus the pi sign, which is not pi, but inflation, whatever the inflation rate might be, and it's always a percentage as well. So this is the formula for the real interest rate. So the real interest rate is the price of borrowing money. If I was going to lend you $100 today and you were going to pay me in a year from now, I'm not just going to charge you the $100 that I lent you today, because I know that prices are going to increase before that year is up. And so in order for me to get the same value of money that I lent you today, I'm going to have to charge you an additional charge that we call the real interest rate. It's the price of, essentially, it's the price of borrowing money. This is what I'm going to have to pay. If I'm going to borrow money, I'm going to have to pay a charge for borrowing that money, and we call that charge the real interest rate, okay? The real interest rate affects people in two different ways. There's two ways that interests affect people's behaviors, okay? There are two people that deal with interest, and so hopefully I can do this. Here you go. So savers are the very first ones, okay? If you think in terms of interest as a saver, banks pay savers money or a certain amount of interest as an incentive to save. Banks want for us to put our money in their banks, because then they can further lend out money. Remember the whole bank expansion, right? The money multiplier, and how they put 10% aside or the reserve requirement aside, and then they can lend out their excess. So banks need for us to put our money in their banks so that they can make a profit, first of all, and second of all, so that that they essentially can feed into this loanable funds market. Okay, savers putting their money in banks. One way that banks get them to, or get us to save money, is by giving us or paying us the real interest rate. So whenever there is a higher, or that we have more of an interest that's being paid to us, then we're more likely to save. As savers, we want the interest rates to be a lot higher. Okay, we want higher interest rates because then we'll earn more money on the money that we're putting into our bank, and will essentially, our investment will be more profitable. So as savers, we want the interest rate to be very high. When interest rates are high, savers have more of an incentive to put their money in the bank, and then we essentially save more than we are spending. Remember that there are only two things to do with your money. You can either save it or you can spend it, and put that into your mind. Always remember that there's only two things that you can do with your money. You can either save it or you can spend it. So when interest rates are high, we're going to save our money. We're not going to spend it. When interest rates are really low, we're going to spend our money. We're not going to save it, because there's not an interest or an incentive into putting our money in banks if the interest rate is really low. Okay, the second way that we affect, or that the interest affects people, are borrowers. So essentially, borrowers are lenders who essentially are banks, banking institutions, like credit unions, anybody who lends out money. They're going to charge a borrower a certain amount of money. We call that the interest rate as well, for the money that they are lending them. Again, because of inflation, they're going to want to earn or have the same value of money that they lent initially when they get paid back. So any lender is going to charge a borrower the interest rate, and that again is the price of borrowing money. So you have to pay this real interest rate based on the amount that you borrow. And if you're having to pay the real interest rate on whatever amount that you borrowed, it is more likely that you're going to borrow money when interest rates are low. So as a borrower, you want the interest rates to be a lot lower. As a saver, you want them to be higher, right? So lower interest rates, you're more likely to borrow money at a lower interest rate, which is why the Federal Reserve Bank, right before the break, I think I mentioned a couple of times that this year they had already lowered the interest rates 3 times to boost our economy, because that they had initially anticipated for our economy to start slowing down. And even more so right now that our economy is at a standstill. For example, like the Department of Education has completely lowered their interest rates for borrowers to a 0%. And not that anybody's borrowing money right now for interest, but for people who are paying back. And they're basically doing that also for debt relief. So that's not necessarily the best example, but it's something to kind of consider. The one thing that I do want for you guys to remember is that as savers, we want the interest rates to be really high, because we're going to make a higher profit on our investment. As borrowers, we want the interest rate to be very low, because we're going to have to be paying back that percentage. So you have to remember that when you're remembering, or when you're working through these issues, through the scenarios of the loanable funds market. So I'm going to leave you at that for this first video. Just a review before the loanable funds, and then we'll get started on what the loanable funds market is.